In December of 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers stationed on an isolated group of islands in the North Atlantic vanished without trace. Was their disappearance the result of a freak accident, or was there something more sinister at work? Join us as we recount the still unsolved mystery of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse. On the evening of the 7th of December 1900, Superintendent Robert Muirhead of the Northern Lighthouse Board stepped off the east landing of Eilean Moore and climbed into his waiting launch. Having shook hands and bid farewell to his 3 colleagues, he now headed out to a larger steam vessel anchored offshore, which would take him back to the mainland. As his small boat made its way over the choppy waters, he looked back at the 3 men he had left behind on the tiny, secluded island to take charge of its lighthouse. Their names were Donald MacArthur, Thomas Marshall, and James Ducat, and they were stood on the landing, waving to him as he raised his hand to wave back. Not once did the thought cross his mind that he would be the last person to ever see them again. For when the relief vessel arrived 19 days later, they were nowhere to be found. The Flannan Isles, a group of 7 small islets situated some 20 miles west of the Outer Hebrides, western Scotland, were to be the setting of this strange disappearance. One which makes this tale all the more unsettling. Something about the mystery of these 3 men, isolated at the edge of the civilized world and surrounded by the vast and hostile Atlantic Ocean, sends a chill up the spine. The islands themselves were named after the 7th century Irish priest, Saint Flannan, and for as long as anyone could remember, they had remained uninhabited. The settlers on the neighboring islands of the Outer Hebrides always viewed this bleak and deserted group of craggy rocks with great superstition. Many fishing boats and merchant vessels had foundered there over the years, and although the Hebrideans often ferried sheep to graze on the Flannan's lush turf, they believed it very unlucky to spend a night there. During the 1890s, the Northern Lighthouse Board decided to construct a lighthouse on Eilean Moore, the largest of the 7 islets. It took 4 years, and building work was constantly hampered by the tempestuousness of the wild Atlantic Ocean, which made it very difficult to land supplies. Nevertheless, the lighthouse was completed and went into operation on the 7th of December, 1899. It had no wireless communication, and the only way of contacting the mainland was through the use of visual semaphore-style signals, which could be seen by the Hebrides on a clear day. The lighthouse itself would have been operated by up to 3 men at a time, with the rotating 4th man spending time on shore. The mystery begins on the night of the 15th of December 1900, when a sudden squall broke out in the vicinity of the islands. The first signs of anything amiss came when the captain of an American steamer, the SS Archtor, making its way from Philadelphia to the port of Leith in Edinburgh, passed close to Eilean Moore just before midnight and noticed that the lighthouse was eerily dark. Something almost unheard of for an operational rock station like the one on the Flannans. This was reported when the ship docked at Leith a few hours later, and although a dark lighthouse would have been considerable cause for alarm, no immediate action could be taken due to the harsh weather. The relief vessel Hesperus was due to set sail on the 20th, but because of the unfavorable conditions, it didn't actually set out until dawn on Boxing Day, the 26th of December, carrying fresh supplies and the relief keeper Joseph Moore. As they approached the east landing, the captain of the Hesperus, Jim Harvey, gave 3 long blasts on the horn and set off a distress flare, but no response was forthcoming. It was obvious from the moment they arrived that something was terribly wrong. There was no welcoming committee from the 3 men who would normally have been outside to greet them. No provision boxes had been put out to be restocked, and the flag wasn't flying on the flag stand. Save for the shrilling and crying of seagulls overhead and the ominous sound of waves breaking against the cliff faces, the isles were eerily quiet. The Hesperus moored in silence, and Joseph Moore set off towards the island alone. Upon reaching the east landing, he immediately made his way up the steep incline and headed towards the lighthouse, calling out to the three men as he went, but there was no reply. He found the entrance gate to the compound and main door both closed, and inside the lighthouse itself, nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. The lamps were cleaned and refilled, the beds were unmade, as if the men had just awoken. The washing up was done, and there were cold ashes in the grate. After his initial observation, he spotted an overturned chair in the kitchen, and then noticed that all the clocks had stopped, which only added to his concerns. Returning to the Hesperus, Moore relayed these findings to the captain, then made his way back up to the lighthouse with more men in the hopes of conducting a wider search. At the East Landing, everything had been intact, but the West Landing provided considerable evidence of damage caused by recent storms. A box at 100 feet above sea level had been smashed, and its contents strewn about. Iron railings were bent over. The railway by the path was wrenched out of its concrete housing, and a rock weighing more than a ton had been displaced above that. On the top of the cliff, at more than 200 feet above sea level, turf had been ripped away as far as 10 meters from the cliff edge. Further investigation revealed that the keepers had kept their log until 9 a.m. on the 15th of December, and their entries made it clear that the damage had occurred before their disappearance. The only other significant piece of evidence was that 2 sets of oilskins were missing. Only 1 set of outdoor gear remained hanging in place by the entrance, suggesting that one of the men must have ventured outside without wearing his protective clothing, which was surprising considering the severity of the weather on the date of the last log entry, and especially during a harsh North Atlantic winter. Of the keepers themselves, there was no sign, either inside the lighthouse or anywhere else on the island. They had simply vanished. Moore and 3 volunteer seamen remained behind to attend to the duties of getting the lighthouse back up and running, whilst the Hesperus returned to the shore station at Breskleet. From there, Captain Harvey sent a telegram to the Northern Lighthouse Board, dated the 26th of December 1900, stating, "A dreadful accident has happened at the Flannans. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the Occasional, have disappeared from the island. The clocks were stopped and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows, they must have been blown over the cliffs, drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that." The riddle of the Flannan Isles has been an endless source of fascination, one which has inspired stories, poems, songs, and even an opera. But the whole truth of the mystery may never be known. A number of embellishments have been added over the years. For instance, it was said that Joseph Moore discovered a half-eaten meal upon entering the lighthouse, a common detail in so many vanishing tales. But in this case, it simply isn't true. Also false are the log entries regarding the keeper's states of mind, which are frequently referred to but never actually existed. The only details recorded in the logbook refer to damage at the West Landing and minor documentation of the storms. There was nothing mentioned about Ducat crying or Marshall being irritable. These were fictitious details added many years later by an American pulp magazine, perhaps to add more intrigue. Even so, no bodies were ever found. No other clues were uncovered. We can only speculate as to what happened on those windswept isles in that cold December during the first year of the 20th century, and theories have ranged from the mundane to the extreme. Some have suggested that one keeper had murdered the other 2 and then thrown them and himself from the cliffs in a fit of remorse. Others suggest that a sea monster had lurched from the wash as the men stood on the West Landing and carried them away, or that they had been kidnapped by foreign spies. Another alleged eyewitness account recalled that a boat full of spirits had been seen rowing towards the islands on the night of the keeper's disappearance. Of course, the legend of the Phantom of the Flannans was widely suspected locally, and particularly in the latter half of the 20th century. Some have even suggested alien abduction. The simplest explanation, though, is usually always the correct one, and as the Northern Lighthouse Board concluded in their investigation, the three men were more than likely surprised by a freak wave and swept away. Thomas Marshall and James Ducat had probably gone to secure some of the damaged equipment at the West Landing, whilst Donald MacArthur had remained inside the lighthouse. As procedure dictated, it was strictly forbidden to leave the lighthouse unattended at any one time. From his vantage point, MacArthur would have been able to see a large swell approaching the islands and must have rushed outside of the lighthouse in the hopes of warning his colleagues, but he got to them too late, and instead, all three men must have been caught in the oncoming wave and swept away. This would certainly explain the overturned chair, as well as the remaining set of oilskins, and also gives a reason as to why all three men had been outside at the same time. However, if MacArthur did leave in such a rush, why was the lighthouse door closed and the entrance gate to the compound locked? And how were three highly experienced men who had spent countless hours surrounded by harsh seas taken unawares by a freak wave? And if that was indeed the case, why had none of the bodies been swept back to shore, as usually happened in these waters? It seems there are still more questions than answers, and perhaps the reality could be far stranger than most of us allow ourselves to imagine. In any case, the lighthouse remained manned, and without further incident up until 1971, when it became fully automated. It is still in operation to this day, and the Isles are now only visited occasionally for maintenance purposes. Over the years, the islands never could quite live up to their cursed reputation, as nothing out of the ordinary ever took place there again. But the mystery of Eilean Moore lives on, perhaps forevermore. In closing, we leave you with the words of Superintendent Muirhead, who, in his official report of the 8th of January 1901, said of the keepers, "I visited them as lately as the 7th of December, and have the melancholy recollection that I was the last person to shake hands with them and bid them adieu.